Hey there everyone, it's Raj from Injury Insight. I'm a doctor of physical therapy. So today's topic is Jaylen Brown's concussion, what happens to the brain during and afterwards, and his recovery. So I hope you find the information educational, practical, and digestible. Alright, so on March 8th, Jaylen Brown versus the Timberwolves suffered a pretty nasty fall. He fell on the back of his thoracic spine, his cervical, his neck, and he also hit his head. So at first everyone was worried about kind of that blunt force trauma. Turns out he was okay in that regard, but he suffered a concussion and he went into the NBA's concussion protocol. So what actually causes a concussion? You might be surprised to know that it's not actually that acute impact. In most concussions, there's actually not a focal brain injury. There's no brain injury that's kind of located in that center or that area of impact. What causes the injury is the force from your head and neck being jerked, and that force is imparted onto brain tissue. Brain tissue is very, very soft biological material. It's one of the softest. So when you have these linear and rotational high acceleration forces, it's going to damage that brain tissue. Rotational forces specifically can cause what's a shear force, like a tearing force, and that can lead to widespread damage. When someone loses consciousness, it's almost exclusively from rotational force causing that widespread shearing and damage. So the person loses consciousness, and that's considered a higher class of severity. All right, so that's the biomechanics of concussion. What actually happens in the brain during concussion? The first kind of the major thing to understand is that there's a neurometabolic cascade that leads to an energy crisis. So what do I mean by this? Let me explain. So every cell in the brain has a membrane. It's like a wall around it. It controls what comes in and what comes out, and it allows the cell to function appropriately. A concussion punctures little holes into that wall. So now you have things coming in and out, ions, a lot of things that aren't supposed to be in there in certain ratios or certain quantities. Okay? And so now the cell's job is always to try to repair equilibrium. So now the brain is trying to devote all its resources to repair that equilibrium with cell membranes. However, there's not cells, but within each cell you have mitochondria. They're like your cell's power plants. They produce energy and ATP, which I'll get to in a second. Those actually become dysfunctional as well. In addition to that, there's reduced cerebral blood flow. Blood flow to the brain is reduced because there's arterial vasoconstriction, which means your arteries are narrowing. So now blood isn't flowing to the brain at the normal quantity. It's actually lower than its normal quantity. And so resources can't get to your brain at the rate that they need to. So demand outstrips supply. So there's a huge gap there for the brain. And I know that's a lot of information to digest. So here's an analogy I like to use. Imagine that a cell in the brain is like a city with the wall around it. That wall is the membrane. It uses that to regulate kind of trade in and out. It's able to regulate who goes in and out. Now there's an earthquake or a concussion, and there's breaks in that wall. Now anyone can come and go as they please, and the cell kind of starts to panic, and then you have neighboring cells also start to panic. That causes what is called diffuse depolarization. So all this is kind of like a chain reaction at that point. So the cell trying to repair equilibrium is trying to get energy and workers in order to repair that. But now you have the cell's factories that are broken down, the mitochondria. You have the arteries or roads that are blocked off. And then lastly, I forgot to mention this before, is that something called intracellular redox actually decreases. Intracellular redox is almost like it allows a cell to stay in equilibrium. And think about it as like it reduces pollution in this city analogy. So if that becomes compromised, now you have a high toxicity level in the city in addition to everything else. So in Jaylen Brown's brain, it's like a city that's recovering from a natural disaster and it doesn't have the resources to do it. I mean, the analogy that comes to mind for me is like Puerto Rico after the most current hurricane, right? There's still areas that don't have energy, really slow rebuilding process because there's not enough resources there or manpower there to do so. The second aspect that happens in the brain is the cytoskeleton gets damaged. The cell cytoskeleton, or the cell skeleton, is responsible for the cell structure, shape, compartmentalization, transport, amongst other things. So if the cytoskeleton gets damaged, it's going to really affect the cell's efficiency. Thirdly, there's axonal dysfunction. Axons are also known as nerve fibers. They help transmit signals from nerve to nerve. So check this picture out of a neuron, and you'll see the axon is that long part in the middle. And axons are really vulnerable to what we talked about earlier, shear force that comes from rotational forces. So these axons can actually get stretched pretty easily, or they can actually get torn and disconnected, which obviously is a big problem because neurons have to communicate. And the fourth aspect is altered neurotransmission. So neurotransmitters are these little messenger chemicals that are transmitted from the end of one neuron to the start of the other. And like I said, they're messengers, so they're involved in communication again. So during concussion, when that gets altered, it affects communication between neurons in your brain. The fifth aspect that happens in this pathophysiology is that there's increased inflammation in the brain. There's an upregulation in inflammatory markers. And this has actually been linked to a development of Parkinson's disease down the line. The sixth aspect is cell death. Now, in a mild TBI, traumatic brain injury, which is almost synonymous with a concussion, there's really not that much cell death that's linked with it. That's more when it comes to more severe injuries. So cell death really isn't an issue when it comes to concussions. All right, that's a lot of information. Check out this infographic that I thought summed up this cascade of events pretty well. All right, so moving on to the symptoms of a concussion. Fair warning, there's a lot of them. It's a pretty brutal injury. So because we just went through some of the processes that occur in the brain, first let's go through some of the symptoms that have been linked to these processes. So check this table out, and I'll describe it here. So ionic flux refers to that when the membrane gets holes in it and you have things coming in and out, it's that ions going in and out. That's what ionic flux refers to. Energy crisis was that mismatch between demand and supply. Axonal injury is the axons being stretched and disconnected. Impaired neurotransmission, again, was those neurotransmitters being altered. And the last aspect, I didn't touch on protease activation, but don't worry about it. And then altered cytoskeleton I touched on was the cell skeleton being altered. And then cell death, all of that doesn't occur that much in a mild TBI. And you can see what they're all linked to. So now, taking a step back, let's talk more about the general symptoms. So there's a really good photo that sums this up. Take a look right here. And again, I'll talk through this. So the major ones to look at here are the most commonly reported things. So you have in the affective or emotional category, anxiety and nervousness, irritability, and depression. Each of these can last from days to weeks. In the cognitive area, the most commonly reported are confusion, which usually lasts minutes to hours, problems with concentration, remembering, disorientation, and these three can last days to weeks, and then feeling foggy or feeling slowed down. Then you have sleep issues. So generally, any sleep alteration here can last from days to weeks, and then commonly reported is drowsiness and increased sleep quantity. And just as a note, sleep quantity does not link with sleep quality. And then from a sensory physical standpoint, the most commonly reported is a headache, which can last from minutes to hours to days to weeks. And for Jaylen Brown, I believe this was his most prevalent symptom. You have dizziness and nausea. These two can last from minutes to hours. Fatigue, light sensitivity, and these two can last from days to weeks. A few other noteworthy ones, sensory and physical ones, are vomiting, which can last minutes to hours, lightheadedness, and tinnitus, which is ringing of the ears. Excuse me. And these last two can last from days to weeks. Now, in addition to these physical symptoms, we have to look at some of the contextual factors in Jaylen Brown's case and the layers that they might add to his case. So for example, he's only 21 years old. We know he's pretty mature for his age, but he's still relatively young and short on life experience. Secondly, basketball is something he does identify pretty closely with, so having that taken away from you can always be an issue. Thirdly, his team's is ramping up for the playoffs. They're locked into the 2 seed pretty well, but still, he's not out there contributing to that. Fourthly, we have the fact that deconditioning from a lack of activity can happen relatively quickly. And so now it's almost been coming up on almost 2 weeks now since the injury. And the last aspect here is there's a lot of a lot of known benefits that come from daily exercise. Increased mood, increased affect, increased sleep, increased regulation, increased sense of self-worth and self-esteem, increased neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, which is the development and creation of new neurons. So, how are all these things affecting Jaylen on a day-to-day basis? However, there's also some good things going for him, mitigating factors. One is the fact that the Celtics medical staff is pretty well versed now with concussions. They went through one with Al Horford last year, and so they really understand that process well. And speaking of Al Horford, Jaylen Brown has a personal resource in someone and a mentor who he can talk to who's been through the same thing. And so it can give him some perspective on what he's going through and understanding that, hey, this is a long-term process, and not to catastrophize some of these symptoms and the variability, which can be frustrating, but it's a natural part of the injury. So the third part here is fencing posture. If you don't know what that is, take a look here. You'll see how Jaylen's left arm is it's flexed, it's bent, and his right arm is sticking straight out. That's called a fencing posture. So I've been asked about this multiple times, and it tends to happen with concussions. And what that actually is, it's actually a reflexive response. So when we're babies, we all have these survival reflexes. There's more than 10 of them. One of them is called your asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, or ATNR. When a baby looks to one side, it actually will point with that arm and flex the other. It's called a fencing posture. So look at the photo of this baby right here. You notice similarities between that and what Jaylen did. So essentially what happens, even though those reflexes go away, they integrate, that code, for lack of a better word, is still in your brainstem. Now, with a concussion, if enough force is imparted onto your brainstem, it can momentarily reactivate or re-trigger that code, so that reflex happens and you stiffen up in that posture for a few seconds and then it comes out of it. So that's what happened in that fencing posture. Moving on to the fourth part, what is the recovery protocol here for concussion? So, in general, 85 to 90% of concussions are resolved within 7-10 days. And it's no coincidence that that 7 to 10 days parallels the number of days that it takes the brain to get out of that energy crisis. Less commonly, it can take up to 2 to 4 weeks. Over 4 weeks is termed something that's called post-concussion syndrome. And these can linger for a long time, usually around less than 3 months, but there's documented cases of over a year. And I've dealt with and treated some of them, and they're brutal. You don't want to wish PCS on anyone. So generally, the guidelines for return to play, not return to play, but concussion guidelines in general are this. So before the season, there's some baseline testing done to get a baseline for that player. If a player during the game is suspected of having a concussion, they're pulled out of the game immediately. And this is critical because research has shown that players who kept playing have recovery times that are double as those who didn't play, who didn't keep playing, and are 8.8 times more likely to have a recovery time that's greater than 3 weeks or 21 days. So now, after that player is pulled out, they're kept away from stimulus for 24 to 48 hours. And that includes lights, crowds, no phone, no computer, no reading, no thinking. So you just want to keep all stimulus away because you want the big idea behind this. You want to allow the brain to recover in that interim period. So now once that period takes place, now you want to see where that person's at. So you see how they compare with that baseline test, see where they are in that regard, and you want to see where their symptoms are as well. And then when it comes to return to play, it's an incremental, stepwise fashion where you're getting progressively more load and exertion, and you're trying to see if that brings on symptoms. And the current protocol is that if there's any symptoms that occur, then that person has to go back to the previous step and complete that step without symptoms in order to return to that step that did cause symptoms. The NBA's protocol is pretty similar to these general guidelines. It adds a few layers. So the baseline testing that the NBA used, they used for the history and physical, they used something that's called a SCAT-3 concussion testing, and they use a Cogstate sports test, which is a computerized test for cognitive function. And the other aspect that they utilize is that they have a director for concussions, Dr. Jeffrey Kutcher, who is kind of the one person that every medical staff has to talk to. And before a player can get cleared, the attending primary care has to talk, or neurologist has to talk to the director in order to clear that player for return to play. And so the NBA does a pretty good job with making their protocol open to the public, and it has a good progression. And we've seen that with Jaylen Brown. We've seen kind of incremental progress. We've seen and heard Brad Stevens talk about where Jaylen is. I think about 5 or 6 days ago, he said that his headache had finally cleared up. And now I think yesterday we had seen, or 2 days ago, we had seen that he's back to those on-court activities. So that's the current paradigm. There's a new emerging paradigm coming out that applies to return to play protocols. So as I had just mentioned, the current paradigm is that you have to have no symptoms as you're going through activity. However, there's some research coming out that shows that you can have some level of symptoms and it doesn't affect your recovery. So we're seeing that the brain is almost like other parts of your body in that a certain extent of symptoms doesn't mean that you stop. So for example, with Achilles tendonitis, when you're recovering, there's a certain extent and response to pain as you're rehabbing that is acceptable. It looks like that might be the same case for the brain as you're incrementally loading it, that it's going to have some symptoms naturally And so it's okay, but there's so many questions that still remain with the ongoing research. What type of patient profile is this most beneficial for? What type of activity is most beneficial? What extent or duration of symptoms is acceptable? And what's the optimal timing or ratio of rest versus activity in this active recovery that's optimal? So these are all questions that have yet to be answered, but there could be coming a phase shift when it comes to some of the return to play protocol based on this emerging paradigm. The fifth part is rehabilitation. The good folks at the UPMC Sports Concussion Program have created this categorization for sports-related concussions that informs the rehabilitation and recovery. There's a great infographic, so I'm gonna put it up here and I'll talk through it. So the first category is cognitive or fatigue. The second is vestibular, which is the balance center. It's one of the main balance inputs in the brain. The third is ocular, so you're gonna have problems with your eyes tracking, converging together in the middle. The fourth is post-traumatic migraine. Includes things like headache, sensitivity to light or noise. Again, I think I mentioned this before, that I think this was a category that Jaylen Brown fell into. You have cervical, which is looking at the injuries that can be caused to the neck and spinal cord from a concussion and impact. And then lastly, you have anxiety or mood. So this is when someone has difficulty not catastrophizing their thoughts, fixating on things, or really excessively worrying or being concerned with certain things. And this last one is actually a key part that leads to post-concussion syndrome. So the point of those categories is, like I said before, is to inform rehab. And so if you can focus on those major deficits and issues, maybe then you can unlock the rest of rehab and make everything else easier if you're first addressing the major deficits. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is the prognosis. Short term and then the long term. So if you haven't figured it out by now, the short-term prognosis is variable. It's based on symptoms. It's going to vary depending on each person. Long term, what we know is that the brain is vulnerable for about 10 to 15 days after a concussion happens. So the key thing is not to allow a person to have another concussion during that period of vulnerability. It can lead to exponentially bad things happening. It's like going back to that city analogy. If you have a city that got hit by a huge earthquake, now it's trying to rebuild, it already has energy deficits, now it gets hammered by another earthquake, right? It's just piling on top of everything. It makes everything worse. That's kind of how it works with a concussion. Now, in certain cases, there's something called second impact syndrome. This hasn't been proven. It's relatively rare, but there's been some cases where a person will have swelling in the brain that's so severe that it can lead to the person dying within minutes of that second concussion occurring. Again, it's pretty rare. So in terms of long term, there's really no great research that shows long term or longitudinal effects from one concussion. There was one paper that showed that individuals who had Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, 20 to 30% of them had suffered a concussion in the past compared to 8 to 10% of those who didn't have it. But it's one study. There's really no consensus on what one concussion can do. Now, there's plenty of research coming out when it comes to multiple concussions, especially as it relates to CTE. We've seen so many high-profile cases recently with NFL players, people donating their brain, and then CTE can cause so many issues: depression, fatigue, decreased impulse regulation, affects the mood, affects pretty much everything. I mean, it's affecting your brain, so it's going to affect everything else. And so there's definitely established research when it comes to that. But in terms of one concussion for Jaylen, there's really nothing there. What you can really do is, treat his symptoms now, make sure that that he continues to be asymptomatic or symptom-free, and then really hope that he doesn't have another concussion, because that is when it can start to lead to other major issues. And so, in general, the major takeaway is that concussions suck. I've treated them, I've seen them, they affect everything. They can be really brutal because of the variability and the extent of the symptoms. However, they are treatable. You can come back from them. You can come back and play well. We've seen it multiple times. And a Celtic example, like I mentioned before, is Al Horford. So I hope you learned some things. And if you're interested in more of these, you subscribe to the channel or leave comments below. Until next time.